What should Christians think of the death penalty? What, if anything, does the Bible have to say about modern justice systems? And if we claim to be pro-life, how does that affect decisions about ending someone's life? We're going to be talking about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. I am Sarah Stone, Outreach Director for Young Adults at MDPC, Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church, and I'm joined by my co-producer and fellow leadership team for Theology on Tap, Evan McClanahan, pastor of First Lutheran. But we're swapping roles today. I'm going to be moderating, and he's going to be saying the juicy stuff. And then our guest today is John Medaille, who retired. That retired is in quotes because he's now teaching theology at the University of Dallas. He teaches social justice and introduction to the Bible. He has authored two books. He might tell you a little bit more about that. And he has a third coming out this fall. He served 2 tours in Vietnam and 5 terms as a city councilman. And of course, like I said, been teaching at the University of Dallas for 15 years. So welcome to our show. And just as a reminder, this is, yes, a podcast, but also we're on the airwaves, KPFT. And you guys hear us say this a lot, but it's important. KPFT is listener-supported community radio. So the way that we can keep doing this and talk about interesting things without commercials is by people like you giving a little bit of money, especially in the name of Theology on Air. We would love that. So just go to kpft.org to check out how you can do that and keep enjoying these. So I think that's all of our pre-game announcements, as it were. We are going to be talking today about the death penalty. So a light, cheery topic. Evan is going to be taking sort of the affirmative stance. I'm going to let each of our guys take maybe 7 to 10 minutes to just tee up what they think about this idea. And then we're just going to pepper them with questions, let them react to each other. And of course, if you're watching on Facebook, you can send in questions too. So why don't we go ahead and let Evan start us off? Is that what we decided?
Sounds good.
All right, Evan, take it away.
All right. Well, John, I didn't know you did 2 tours in Nam, so thank you for your service. And hearing all of your credentials, I'm way outgunned in this debate or conversation, really. But
I hope that too.
Anyway, I really do appreciate you joining us. It's a conversation I've been wanting to have for a while. It's sort of rarely had, believe it or not, in Christian circles. It's hardly ever debated, as far as I can tell. But here's kind of a bottom line, maybe to begin with, which is that whether we like it or not, God did institute the death penalty. It's true. It's right there in the Bible, in the Old Testament. I would argue as well in the New, though maybe harder to find. You see it before and during and after the Mosaic covenant. In Genesis 9:6, it says, for example, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made man." In the Mosaic covenant, for a variety of offenses, up to 26, the death penalty is at least a possible punishment. Now, my main argument here is to say that while a lot may have changed in the last 2,000 years, and a lot may have changed with the death and resurrection of Christ, of course, and while we may find the death penalty objectionable, and while the Old Testament may just be some cultic document that represents ignorant understandings of justice, God really did institute the death penalty. So that means we have to deal with it. You know, we have to have a good reason, you know, to say it continues, or a good reason to say that it doesn't. I don't think it's something we can ignore. And this ends up being a kind of Rorschach test, I think, ultimately about how we understand God, revelation, the continuing of revelation, justice, mercy, all of those sorts of things. I believe that how we do so, or how we look at this issue, will shed light on what we really believe about God and his revelation, which is why this is an important study for me. It's not like I just go crazy to talk about the death penalty, but it's a useful conversation in ferreting out kind of other things that we believe about God. If you argue against the death penalty, then understand what or who you're arguing against. Assuming that you're not just stating, you know, your own personal preferences, like, I just don't like the death penalty, well, then you're ultimately going to be arguing against God's right to empower the state to take a life for certain offenses. If you're arguing for it, then again, assuming you're not just stating personal preferences, then understand that you're arguing in favor of some kind of continuity between the Old and New covenants. As, again, the New Testament is largely silent on this, but I'll give a few examples where I think it's not. My concern is that when we deny the death penalty outright out of a kind of personal preference or sentiment or even a false view of God, then we're not really honoring God and his word. It just seems or feels wrong to us. So we just don't want to have to deal with that. So I'm not going to be in favor of a death penalty. Death penalty is negotiable. Well, what else might end up being negotiable as well? When answering the question of whether or not the death penalty remains in force, it might be helpful to mention a few categories by which we understand Old Testament law. Very quickly, Old Testament law is often divided into moral, civil, and ceremonial categories. And the death penalty in the Old Testament Mosaic Code is enacted. It's a punishment for offenses along those lines. I would basically argue that some of the civil laws, which would merit the punishment, are also moral laws, right? So murder is a moral offense. It's also a civil offense. But I think we would all agree that in Christ, the ceremonial law has been fulfilled, so that death penalty offenses that are tied to that would now be abrogated. They would be really fulfilled. I don't like the word abrogation, but they would be fulfilled. And so by my count, there are 26 offenses that merit the death penalty in the Old Testament, but 3 would remain, because 23 are, and I'm stealing now from Joel McDermott in his book, The Bounds of Love, where he talks about how there are seed laws, inheritance laws, clearly ceremonial functions tied to the nation state of Israel that are so important to God for the continuity and the survival of God's people, Israel, that the death penalty is enacted for things like blasphemy and other sexual offenses and things like that. In the New Testament, we see that those kinds of offenses are punished really by excommunication, right? So if you look at Paul in 1 Corinthians, you don't even associate with the sexually immoral. Okay, so might have been death penalty in the Old Testament, but now in the light of Christ, it's not a death penalty offense. It's a matter of a lack of fellowship. And so in the Bonds of Love, or the Bounds of Love rather, Joel McDermott, for example, he argues that there would be 3 crimes today that would merit the death penalty, that they would still be enforced, that they transgress or transverse national boundaries. They're moral crimes at all time. And since God is the God of the whole universe at all time, they would still merit the death penalty. They would still be justifiable in any context. And that would be murder, rape, and kidnapping. Now, mind you, to advocate for the death penalty is not to glory in death. I mean, this isn't really a fun position to take, but it is to defend the victims of crime and to defend future victims. We kind of live in interesting times, too, because on the one hand, we see, for example, in the Me Too movement, this huge rush to speak for the victim. But at other times, it seems like we don't speak for the victim at all. And so, again, this is a conversation that helps us figure out how to do that. To anticipate maybe some exceptions or objections to this, maybe not from John, but from others, many might point to Jesus addressing the lex talionis in the Sermon on the Mount. That's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And so people will say, well, Jesus clearly says that law is no longer in effect. I would argue, and I'm again stealing from Joel McDermott here, that what Jesus is against really there is the concept of personal vengeance, that the teaching there is not to do away with at all times and all places, the civil death penalty, but simply that we're not to seek personal vengeance, and we're not to go over and above the justice there. It's only an eye for an eye and only a tooth for a tooth, for example. Another common objection people say is that you can't be pro-life and pro-death penalty, that is against abortion and for the death penalty. But I don't know why those two things are brought together. Clearly, a human being in utero is not guilty of any civil offenses, and therefore they haven't done anything to merit the termination of their heartbeat or breath or brain activity. Meanwhile, assuming the guilt of the accused, which we'll talk about, the criminal has done something that at least merits some punishment. Whether it's death or not, we could discuss. But on a related note, a person convicted of the death penalty can still be forgiven of their sins and can still spend all of eternity in the presence of God. Therefore, the idea that we have to have all justice now or what have you isn't correct. God is not under any obligation to provide us with long life, and even criminals can be forgiven of all sin. That might help mitigate our understanding of this. Finally, well, I've argued for these three uses of the death penalty, and I may appear to some of you to be a complete barbarian. I would assure you that I'm a lot nicer than a lot of our theological heroes. In the traditions of the Roman Empire, who first killed Christians, then they turned around and killed pagans and other heretics. Well, really, Luther and Calvin were in many respects in that same tradition. You know, Luther oversaw the death of Anabaptists. Aquinas called for the death penalty for first table offenses, first table of the Ten Commandments, blasphemy, worshiping other gods, etc. So, just compared to them, I just want to say I'm a pretty nice guy. And with that, I'm done.
I like ending on "I'm a nice guy, trust me." That's always good.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, John, yeah, take a few minutes of your own to kind of push back and give us your thoughts on the death penalty.
Sure. Well, rather than take a position right now, let me start out by trying to frame the question, because in approaching any difficult and complex question, and the death penalty, I think, certainly qualifies as such, I think it is first important to lay out the kinds of questions that must be dealt with before we can reach a conclusion. So let me outline some of these questions. Concerning the death penalty, I think there are three classes of questions that need to be dealt with. These questions can be characterized as arguments from efficacy, from ethics, and from prudence. The first question is, does the death penalty actually deter crime? This is the question of efficacy. The second is, whether or not it deters crime, is it simply a requirement of justice? This is the argument from ethics. And the third is, can it be safely applied? This is the argument from prudence. No other questions occur to me about this issue, so I think I've exhausted most of the major issues that have to be dealt with. Now, for each of these questions, we have to specify what will count as evidence and what standards will be used to resolve or at least clarify the questions. So let me take each question in turn, not to answer it, but to determine what we will consider as evidence. So, does the death penalty deter crime? One of the strongest arguments in favor of the death penalty is simply that it deters the murderer, and that the state indeed has the obligation to protect its citizens. It would seem self-evident that a person who commits a serious crime would be deterred by the thought of punishment, and that the death penalty would be the ultimate deterrent. Given that there are states and nations with and without the death penalty, states that had the death penalty and now do not have it, or states that went the opposite way, we should have a well-developed body of empirical evidence on which to reach a secure conclusion, or at least to discuss the question in an informed way. Moreover, the death penalty has been applied throughout history for a wide variety of crimes, ranging from petty theft to heresy. Therefore, a study of history should give us some insight into the efficacy of this punishment, not only for our own age, but for ages past. However, the question about punishment is always muddled by the question about whether the person thinks they will be caught. Surely, if I decide to shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue in broad daylight, there is a high probability that I will be caught, and the thought of retribution might possibly deter me. But most murderers are not like that, and the perp usually operates in secret in the belief that the crime will remain unsolved. So connected with the question of deterrence is the question of the certainty of punishment. Now, the second question is it required by justice? Because regardless of whether a punishment works as a deterrent, it may be a simple requirement of justice. Certainly, any victim of crime has the right to demand at least a restorative justice. And in the case of murder, where restoration is impossible, he has the right to demand that the murderer, under the time-honored lex talionis, an eye for an eye, forfeit his life. The sources for the answer to this question are obvious for the Christian: sacred scripture and the traditions of the Christian churches. Now, it is without doubt that the death penalty is part and parcel of the law of Moses. I believe Father McClanahan pointed out 26 offenses which merited the death penalty. And Jesus himself says that he will not change a single letter of the law. And it is equally true that the death penalty has a long history in Christian communities. And if we leave the matter there, the matter is settled. If one accepts revelation as something static, then of course the question is settled even before it is asked. The Bible is unequivocal about the question, and this was sufficient justification for most of human history. Indeed, the question really only arises in our own age, which is suspicious in itself. But again, it's never quite that simple. For there is another way to look at revelation and tradition. Just as in the Bible itself, there is a progression in the idea of God, from very simple, almost pagan concepts, to the totally unexpected idea of an incarnate God who is himself a community of persons. So there is a progress in the tradition, which brings us to an ever-deepening understanding of the implications of the gospel in our own personal, social, economic, and spiritual lives. This is especially true when we look at a God who has himself endured capital punishment. Mm-hmm. And this very fact puts the death penalty in a new light. So, what standards prevail in answering this question? For a Christian, the whatever answer one reaches has to be shown to be compatible with our understanding of the gospel. Obviously, there can be different standards of interpretation. But in the attempt to conform all of our answers to the gospel, we get, at the very least, a clarification of how we view the gospel in practical terms and how we think we should apply it to our lives. Finally, there is the question of whether such a final punishment can be applied justly in an imperfect world. It is without doubt that every human institution is prone to error. And such efforts as the Innocence Project reveal that the rate of error in convictions is high enough to demand that we give at least some thought to this question. Because if it turns out that a significant number of people are executed unjustly, then even persuasive ethical and pragmatic arguments fail. So granting that errors are inevitable, we have to ask, what rate of error, if any, is high enough to invalidate our arguments in favor of the death penalty? Or we can ask, is the very inevitability of error sufficient to negate such an irreversible punishment? What I've outlined here is not a position. I have one, and I'll be willing to share it. But first, I want to put out a framework for discussion to reach a position that at least takes account of all the major questions. Surely there are other questions we can pose, such as what kind of a society we wish to have. But without answering these questions, we cannot reach an informed answer to the question. So with that kind of taxonomy of the answers,
that's a great start. I love it. Let me just ask quickly before we get into arguments and rebuttals and that sort of thing. John, what what is kind of your background that even led you into to think about this? Is it just a personal interest? Did you, I mean, you're Catholic, is that right?
I am, yes.
And you called Evan Father McClanahan, which I love.
Was that not correct?
I do have 2 kids, so.
There you go.
I'm Lutheran. I'm Presbyterian. You're Catholic. So this is a little taste of what heaven will look like, maybe. But
yeah.
So
not good
I'm sorry, but I thought Lutheran priests were addressed as father. Was I incorrect in that?
I kind of joke, I'm not a father because I have children. So, pastor usually, but.
Okay.
Yeah. Whatever doesn't offend your sensibilities.
Well, my sensibilities are pretty leatherback. It's hard to offend.
Yeah.
John, also, if you could blow us some smoke rings with that epic beard and give us kind of a Gandalf moment, we'd really appreciate it. Okay. So is this just something that has always interested you personally? Or, I mean, look at that. I mean, that makes the whole thing worth it.
If they're listening on the podcast, they're missing the smoke rings. That's too bad. You're gonna have to go on Facebook and find these people. Yeah.
That's right. Or YouTube.
Yeah.
So yeah, how did you come to give this so much thought?
Well, I teach social justice.
Oh yeah.
And of course, this is a social question, and in a sense, it's kind of an acid test question. I think the way Pastor McClanahan placed it, it does become kind of a test of how you look at the whole gospel tradition, how we interpret it, etc., and how we apply it. Okay, because obviously that's sort of a definitive application.
Sort of the final application, yeah. So I want to give each of you a chance just to kind of react to what the other one said. But Evan, I want to definitely, if this wasn't already part of your plan, one of the people on Facebook is asking, and I have the same question, with regard to the third question that John presented about sort of the prudence. It's always been kind of my thought that even if we could land that conceptually it makes sense, the fact that we're fallible, the fact that we mess up, the fact that there is something like the Innocence Project out there, isn't that enough reason to say we won't do this? Because we know we'll mess up, and that's something we would never want to mess up about. I would love to hear you talk about that, and then any other comments you have about what you heard John say.
Yeah, I think that is a good argument against the death penalty. I listened for a while. I just kind of stopped for whatever reason, not for any particular reason, but the Wrongful Conviction podcast, which is put out more or less through the Innocence Project, and they tell stories of people who are wrongfully convicted. They estimate about 5% of everyone in prison in America is wrongfully convicted. And there's no doubt that there have been people who have been executed who were innocent of the crime they were convicted of. And there are all sorts of reasons that people are wrongfully convicted. Jailhouse snitches, junk science, lying witnesses, faulty eyewitnesses. If you ever seen a Making a Murderer, that's how the guy got into jail the first time. The victim claimed it was certain it was this guy. The Bible seems to speak about wanting as much certainty as possible, but I assume that the Bible assumes that such certainty is impossible, and yet we proceed with justice anyway. So generally speaking, it's 2 witnesses that you see over and over, say in the Old Testament, that are required before someone would merit the death penalty. Now this is interesting. Just last night I was watching I think it was Forensic Files, and there was
right.
Yeah, there was a kind of a mad scientist, and he basically poisoned his neighbors by expertly putting thallium in Coca-Cola bottles that they drank, and because he was mad at them about something.
It doesn't have that already?
What's that?
It doesn't have that already?
No, I mean, it's the only chemical it doesn't have. Yeah,
I'm
everything else.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, because it would kill all their customers. That's the problem. And so, and there were no witnesses. So what do you do in that situation? You read the Bible in such a way that would say, well, no witnesses, he can't get the death penalty, even though you could prove with certainty through circumstantial evidence that he in fact committed the crime. So I think the 2 witnesses thing would be something we'd have to figure out. Like, does circumstantial evidence act as a witness by proxy? What about electronic communication or a confession? What about, I mean, there are all kinds of things that you say, well, does that act as a witness? In the Old Testament, it just says 2 witnesses. I don't think, though, that you...
I remember Susanna and the elders.
Yeah, exactly. I don't.
There were two witnesses.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. They can conspire, right? I mean, it could just be evidence of two people lying. And so, I don't think though that you can. At the end of the day, I would key in more on the ethics, the second issue that John raised. I think that really is the issue, and that's what I'm really interested in. I mean, I might end up with this conversation saying, you know what, I don't believe that that the state of Texas or the nation of, the United States should execute anybody. But I still think that we should be willing to go as far as God would go when it comes to justice. And so I think ultimately it's an ethical concern. I would say though that no justice, whether it goes all the way to the death penalty or not, is going to be executed perfectly, and yet we still do it. So, but we could talk later about, because as you said, in the Bible, justice is retributive, right? So if you steal, you're caught and you return it, I think it's you give back what you took plus 20%. But if you steal and you don't get caught, it's like 5 times. There are these retributions that you pay. But between victim and perpetrator, there is restitution. But you can't do that. You can't bring a life back. So the only thing that you can do is take the life of the person who took the life to begin with. And so I think there's consistency there. We could argue that the modern penal situation is ridiculous. There is no restitution.
Well, that was one of my questions for sure for both of you is, I remember being picked for a jury one time, and one of the questions they asked ahead of time, I guess I answered the questions the way they wanted. I also cried. I think that helped. But they asked, they told a really sad story and I wept. And so, I don't know, maybe they thought I was soft. But anyway, they asked a question, what do you believe the goal of imprisonment is? Do you think it's punishment or reform? And I realize it could be, maybe a false dichotomy, but that's how they posed it. So I'm curious to hear both of your responses to that. But John, just what are your kind of first blush responses to what Evan said, either in his initial statements or just now?
Sure. Evan is dealing with the ethical question, and he's putting it, I think I'd be correct to say that he's putting it entirely on ethical grounds. The problem is, there's 2 problems. That it doesn't prove the case, that it proves too much. It seems to me that you have arbitrarily then limited it to the 3 of the 26 cases. All right. Now the Bible, remember, put forth this for the 26 crimes, including things like adultery. All right. And you've limited it to 3. And I wonder what your biblical warrant for doing so is. So that seems to me, how do you escape the charge of just sort of a theological political correctness here, and that rather than executing for adultery or any of the other 26 crimes, you've just limited it to the 3. I don't quite understand your grounds. And I don't know of any grounds that you can distinguish there that wouldn't call the whole thing into question. So if there's 23 things that used to demand from God himself the death penalty, and now there are only 3, what's your biblical warrant? Yeah.
So I would say this is a matter, it's debated among, let's say that there are Christians who agree that the death penalty, and they agree that the death penalty should be for 3 or more of the offenses in the Old Testament. But there is not unanimity on where to draw that line. I mean, I put this forward.
Wait, look, pause. Pardon for interrupting. You drew the line, the Bible. Right. You drew the line, the Bible. Okay. But you erased the line you erased the line 23 times.
Yeah.
Where was your warrant? If you're going to say biblical inerrancy or something like that, where is your warrant for erasing 23 lines?
Yeah, well, it goes back to understanding the categories of law as moral, civil, and ceremonial, and understanding that the moral law continues, The moral law of God is tied to the nature of God, so it continues in perpetuity.
Okay.
And then the ceremonial law, though, clearly is done away with because, there are no more sacrifices at the temple, eating shellfish, things of that nature.
Are you saying that 23 of these didn't fall under the civil law or the moral law, but under the ceremonial law?
Well, ceremonial or tied to that particular land. And this is the argument that, say, I mentioned Joel McDermott in his book, The Bounds of Love, which I'm riffing on here. So his argument is that when you look at things like seed laws, so why adultery? Why homosexuality, for that matter? Why would that be a death penalty offense? Well, because God gives provision of these people to this land. They are to be fruitful and multiply. They are to fill that land with his 12 tribes, with his people, in preparation for the Messiah. And when they rebuffed that, they're not trusting in God's provision. Now, eventually, with the death of Christ, we see a different ministration or different dispersal of the people of God. Now we're not tied to a temple. We're not tied to that land. We're not tied to those tribes. So now things change. And so that would be the argument. And so why is adultery? Why would that be offense? Same thing. It's the destruction of a family. It's the wickedness of not.
It still is.
What's that?
It still is the destruction of the family.
No, I agree. And there are people who think that adultery is still a death penalty offense. I wouldn't go that far. But
why not?
Feisty guess if we got one.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I might not even be in favor of those three. I was more putting out as a way to frame the conversation, right? Because I agree with you that you have to decide where you draw a line and why. It may be that murder is the only thing that really merits the death penalty. But I think that is clear. Yeah.
You have put the standard for drawing the line, and the standard was biblical. And now the standard's not biblical.
No, all the examples I've given are biblical, but clearly, look, you can look at the New Testament, okay? And Paul did not go, in speaking about homosexuality, Paul did not go to the local civil magistrate and demand their death. It was excommunication. So clearly in the New Testament, there are lines drawn about what would merit the death penalty and what wouldn't. So I think I'm in good course to narrow it from 26 down to these three.
Well, no, in the New Testament, I don't see any justification for the New Testament to draw a line around these three. What I'm saying is that you're trying to do it both ways. You're trying to make it biblical, but then trying to limit the Bible to these cases. Okay, but I say if you can erase it for 23 times, why can't you erase it 26 times?
Because those three are moral crimes. They have nothing to do with the ceremonial aspect of the law. They have nothing to do with...
Yeah, so does homosexual is a moral crime too. It doesn't have
right.
anything to do with the ceremonial law.
Well, yes, but maybe the answer is I'm not sure. But let's consider the early Christians for a moment in the Roman Empire where homosexuality was rampant. Maybe it doesn't make sense for Paul to say, if there's a bunch of guys over there engaging in homosexuality, constable, our law says that they deserve the death penalty. The constable would be himself coming out of a brothel going, I'm sorry, what? Maybe I should put you to death, So I'm trying to make a modest argument that it's not necessarily that I'm not trying to argue that we should definitely be killing people for these three offenses. I'm just trying to give that as an example of a way to think about it, because my real question and my real objection is how far are we willing to go in our defense of God and God's providence and God's right to demand justice. What I find among a lot of Christians, more liberal than either one of us, I'm sure, but a lot of Christians have a personal reaction against the death penalty without really being able to give a good reason for it. And I find that troubling. What I find is that if you're not willing to, some people would even basically say, I don't worship the God of the Old Testament. Right. So even if you and I said all 26 are fulfilled in the death of Christ, right? There would still be people who would say, yeah, but that's a different God in the Old Testament. And I would really want to challenge that.
Yeah, let me just jump in here and ask, for those people that are listening that are maybe a little bit lost, though I'm really enjoying this. Are you, John, saying much better than I'm about to say it, but are you basically saying there were justifications for the death penalty in the Old Testament, but because of the death of Christ, we no longer live under that kind of law? 26 out of 26, all out of all. I mean, is that kind of the line in the sand ethically?
No, I haven't got that far yet. I may get that far.
Okay.
My question was simply, if you can erase it 23 times, why not 26?
No, I get that point.
Yeah.
That was
Okay. Now, then we can go into, okay, should we erase it the other 3 times? Okay.
Okay, well, let's assume that we're there.
Now, but Christ himself was faced with this question.
Mm-hmm.
And you both know.
We know where this is going.
Yeah. Of course, everybody knows where this is going because
ahead of you. They've already asked the question. Yeah.
The woman taken with adultery.
Yeah.
And now, that's such a rich story. I mean, in a whole bunch of different ways.
Yeah, in a whole other podcast, we could just talk about it for sure.
I mean, but one of the things that he deals with actually goes to this third question, the prudential question, because the old law dictated death for both men and women taken in adultery, but they only brought the woman. Okay. Right. So my question is, was she alone at the time? You know,
I'm going to say no. It's been a while, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a different form of adultery than the one I'm used to. But this goes to the question of how the law is enforced. And the law there was enforced mainly against women, because men, well, we all know,
they never,
men, right? Yeah, I mean, you know. But today, the law is often enforced against people who happen to be of the black persuasion.
We actually had someone on Facebook ask about that, talking about where does race fall into this, or marginalized then, marginalized now. Yeah. Exactly.
And in that sense, this woman was black in the sense of this is the one who we want to enforce the law against, even though the law requires 2 people to be stoned here. We're only stoning 1. And Christ says, well, he doesn't say much of anything. He just keeps drawing figures in the sand and says, you know, all right, those of you without sin, cast the first stone. So if I was going to erase the line, I mean, that gives you a clear basis for erasing the line here on adultery. But it also gives you a basis for erasing, 25 other lines. Now, I don't say that you should, but this is at least a basis for it. I'm
so sorry.
So there is an ethical, so the point here is that the ethical framework does change with the New Testament. And so you cannot accept the law of Moses as definitive in this. And so the law of Moses definitively calls for the death penalty. Are we still bound by that? And it is not altogether clear to me that we are.
Fair enough.
The only thing, and I don't want to take a way out on that text, because I tend to believe that is a true story, but that is a text that comes into the Gospel of John some centuries later, and it was in other Gospels before, and it's moved around, and that sort of thing. But I tend to accept it as a true story, and the question is about that, and I'm not trying to work around it. However, that is also a passage that can be used kind of like by, say, relativists. Well, see, none of us can judge anybody because, we're all guilty of some wrongdoing. And I don't know that we could take it that far because, of course, Jesus then says to the woman, go and sin no more. So that's kind of my struggle with that text. And, even in the Old Testament, I think that just because that's why I said there are 26 for whom the death penalty is at least possible. But there would have been many situations where just because it was possible didn't mean it was necessarily carried out in each and every situation. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there could have been times where the death penalty was, proper, but that was not the decision that was made. And I think in that situation, Jesus wants us to look into our hearts at our own sin rather than making her the, as you said, the black person. We mean that metaphorically, who we're gonna blame for all of our social problems. So, yeah.
One comment, and you bring up an issue that I think is quite legitimate. That this story is obviously, and I agree with you, in addition to the Bible. It's not in it used to be in the Gospel of Luke, and then it got moved around, and I think it was in Matthew for a while, and then in some editions, and finally found a fixed place in John. However, that's true of a lot of the stories in the Bible. For instance, John 22nd is obviously a later edition. I mean, the story ends at 21, and then all of a sudden you have the second story, which is by the lakeside. They were in Galilee. I mean, they were in Jerusalem. The whole thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But John, the half of John 6. Nevertheless, for me, that actually makes the story stronger. This was the early church reflecting on the meaning of Christ. So now remember, these are people who didn't argue in the sense that we argue in the scholastic tradition by rationalism, by putting forth propositions and resolving them dialectically. They argued by stories. And their impression of Jesus Christ is that he would not be the person casting the first stone. And so, in a sense, this testimony is stronger than if it had been an actual story. This is how the early Christians reacted to Christ. And so, yes, and since the early Christians can ask this question, the very question we're debating on Zoom, they debated by stories. Yeah. And this story is how they debated it. And in that sense, the story is even, if anything, more powerful, at least for me. So I think we have to consider that in relation to evaluating the law of Moses, and in regard to the law of Moses, let me shift there. Jesus says, I will not change one letter or one small part of a letter of the law. Instead, the law will be fulfilled. But in fulfilled, it's negated because you don't need it anymore. It overflows. It overflows. And then by the time you get to Paul, now, for the early Christians, they were still observing the law. But by the time you get to Paul, you have the same kind of debate you and I are having right now. Mm-hmm. How much of the law do we have to observe? And for the party of the Pharisees, which was probably the dominant party in the church, well, it's all 613 commandments. And Paul says, it's 0 commandments.
Yes. I mean, and yet you and I both agree that we ought to be obedient to the law of God, right? And so where do we get that? Where do we, what does that really look like? And again, if it comes down to, say, our own piety, our own obedience to the law, our own bigness of heart in terms of forgiving, I mean, I'm right there with you. I mean, I might leave this not being in favor of the death penalty, but for the sake of argument, I want to argue for it. And again, my concern is that Christians they have a sentiment that God is just kind of against the death penalty, and they don't really take God seriously. I would also say a couple things. I said it's not mentioned much in the New Testament. And so one verse where I do think it's brought up would be Romans 13, verses 3 and 4. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. And I believe that reference to bearing the sword is capital punishment. And
on your head.
Yeah. And so Paul doesn't seem to suggest there. Now, again, Paul's living in the context of the Roman Empire and such, and that might, change things. If we have the freedom in, say, I don't know, the New World to establish the government that we want, maybe we say this is going to be a Christian nation, and we're not going to have the death penalty, even though Paul said it was okay in Romans Day. That's okay. But also, I mentioned, Genesis 9, so that's pre-Mosaic law, and that's why. So my basic argument would be that why 23 versus 26. My basic argument would be that some of the law, much of the Mosaic law is confined to a time and a place, but some of the law, like the Ten Commandments, for example, is applicable across all time and space because it reflects the moral nature of God, and therefore those penalties for those. I mean, for example, let's say the Canaanites. Because there were Canaanites even after Moses was said to slaughter them all. Anyway, there were still Canaanites. They're still hanging around, and they ended up still living with the Israelites. Well, would they be executed for kidnapping, say? Yeah, they would have been. In my understanding, they would have been executed because they violated a moral law. They weren't under the Levantine laws, but they weren't under they were under other laws. Because those would transgress or transverse national boundaries. So, I mean, it's not an argument everyone's going to agree with. I understand that. But again, my concern is when people will have a very narrow kind of pietistic understanding of Jesus and that's what I want to know, really, is, are we to live in a way where we are to seek the humility and the love of Christ, all the warm fuzzies? And I don't mean that in a patronizing way. I really do mean that. But on the other hand, as a society, we still have what some political candidates will talk about as law and order, right? I mean, where do you draw the line? Like, let's say
that's the efficacy argument.
Yeah.
That's the efficacy argument. So that is an empirical question. That's not a biblical question. That's an empirical question. And so that question, we argue, I think there's enough grounds to reach a reasonable judgment on the efficacy of the death penalty, both in our current age and in prior ages. So remember,
and as a reminder, the efficacy argument is whether or not it deters crime, exactly. Whether it works. Yeah.
Sure. And that now, I'm not a statistician. Okay, so I don't want to overstate the case, but I can state that in excess of 80% and as high as 88% of criminologists who have looked at this, I said that there is no effect from the death penalty in deterring crime.
Wow.
Now, it could be the 12% that are left over are right and that the 88% are wrong. But we can reasonably draw the conclusion from the data that if it does have an effect, it's not such an effect that it's immediately apparent in the data. Okay, it has to be a slight effect. Now, we can look at previous ages and remember, you used to have the death penalty for petty crimes.
Mm-hmm.
There's not the slightest evidence that it reduced petty crimes. Okay, not the slightest evidence. Rather, it reflected the fear of those who were well off against criminality. Okay, it reflected more their fears than it was any useful in any, criminal logic. Or we can take the question of heresy. Remember, Pastor, my people used to burn your people.
Mm-hmm.
And vice versa, but we did
as
that.
Good as we get.
And yet, yes, you did, and yet you're still here. If it was efficacious, we wouldn't even be having this conversation.
I told you, I'm a nice guy. What can I say?
So it didn't prevent heresy. It didn't prevent petty theft. So on the grounds of efficacy, most criminologists, I cannot evaluate their work. I can only report it and say that most criminologists think it doesn't work as a deterrent.
Actually,
so
I think
the law and order argument collapses.
I think actually I'd largely agree with you on that because for a lot of reasons. One is that when people are committing crimes, they're like you said, they're assuming they're not going to get caught in many cases. Now, interestingly, it's always interesting to me, like someone say in prison for 20 years or something, or maybe they've been in prison for a while, and then the death penalty becomes a possibility. Maybe they committed another crime. They'll do anything to avoid the death penalty. Now, that's interesting to me. It's like once they are under the gun, or people once they're pleading, right? This is one of the powers of the plea, but I don't like plea bargains for a lot of respects. I understand why they happen, but one of the things that'll happen is they've got someone dead to rights, all the evidence, they know he did it, and they make a plea bargain deal, right? If you confess to it, then you won't get the death penalty. And many times they'll do it because even if they'll be on death row for 15 years, they don't want the prospect of death hanging over their head. And I always think that's very interesting. So I do, it might not have deterred the original crime, but it does have a psychological effect on people and how they take deals. But I would give an example, and this might be a horrible example. But some days, on my worst days in America, I think I'd like to live in Singapore. You know, you can be executed in Singapore for carrying 18 grams of cannabis. I looked it up today. 18 grams. That's not much. And Singapore is an extremely strict state, but you don't spit on the sidewalk, right? Remember that poor American that was caned when I was a kid, you know, because he egged some cars or did graffiti or something. Awful. Yeah. And I'm kind of joking. It's not a free country, basically. It's a kind of a...
And you want to live in abject fear all the time?
Well, no, I wouldn't. But the question is it efficacious?
Yes.
And so it kind of depends. It's like, well, it's efficacious depending on how much freedom you want to have, right? So, but I generally agree the way it's applied today, it seems not to be efficacious. I think that I would not use that argument in deciding it because I think the ethical considerations would override it. And really, my argument, and that's why we wanted another Christian to be on this conversation, not just a secular person who opposes the death penalty, because it's a question of like, what should we as Christians think about it? Because we want the love of Christ to dwell within us, but there's also this justice of God that demands our attention. So
I want to jump in here real fast. You guys, man, you could do this without me. You do not need me. But one of the questions that came in for John, because 9 out of the 10 questions that have come in attacking Evan. Evan, how could you think this? We're made in God's image. Big surprise there. People like to... Okay,
then I hope they're all pro-life. I hope they are radical abolitionists when it comes to abortion. I bet they're pro-choice.
No. But one of the questions that I was talking about earlier with Evan is it possible that if we deny the possibility of the death penalty, that in some sense, and I don't know if this falls under ethics or efficacy or somewhere in the middle, but are we actually saying that the criminal's life has more value than the victim's, especially if you think of something like murder or rape?
Oh, yeah. No, it's a good question. It's an excellent question. That is, and this is, the justice argument, I think, is stronger from the standpoint of the victim than the standpoint of society. Society, quite frankly, will defend itself. Okay. And so what about the husband who has lost a wife to murder? I mean, he frankly wants to string that SOB up, and he has a right to feel that way.
Yeah.
Or the father who's lost a daughter,
oh yeah,
he has every right to feel that way, and there is no question about it. So it takes an almost supernatural grace to say, I want to bring this person to penance. Now, we had an idea of imprisonment. We shifted the idea in theory from penal, from pure punishment to, we called them penitentiaries. We were going to bring people to penitence. It was, in theory, a very Christian idea of punishment. Now, of course, it simply doesn't work that way. But nevertheless, it still is, from the social standpoint, it still is the ideal we still really need to find ways to build penitentiaries rather than prisons, I think.
Interesting.
And to bring everybody, the lowest of the low, back to repentance and to God. Now, and there's another thing. We don't know where that murderer came from. You see, I don't think anybody kills anybody by themselves. I think everybody got there through some path, through some twisted maze. All right? I think pure evil is almost impossible. You know, something made that person so twisted and so dense to the moral law that he could not see it. But he didn't do it by himself. He did it from an abusive father, or he did it from some weird kind of mother, or he did it raising in an environment where violence was survival.
Sure.
Now, I'm going to say, I grew up on the island of Manhattan. It was a happy childhood in a lot of ways. But I happen to know that many people who grow up on the island of Manhattan don't always have a happy existence, okay? And they end up very, very violent, very violent. What I'm saying is that, pardon me, Ezekiel, but there really are no individual crimes.
And that just took us to a whole other argument, my goodness.
Exactly. We are all, in some sense, implicated in the crime. All right? And so, don't get me wrong, I still want to see that SOB suffer, okay? But at the same time, I personally feel a little reluctant to talk about a final punishment without talking also then about understanding the conditions that create this.
Sure. I'm so sorry to have to do this, but we are legitimately running out of time. Sure. Evan, do you want to just give, because he sort of said something meaningful there, do you want to give any sort of quick retort to that? We have like a minute, not even.
Can we keep going on Facebook Live till maybe 7:20?
I'll wrap us up. Do you want a final?
Yeah. No, I agree with what he said. The difference between penitentiary and prison is very important, and that's a whole other conversation we do need to talk about. So actually, I agree with everything you said there. Let me just say, people saying on Facebook, how can you say that they're made in the image of God? I'm telling you what the Bible says. Okay, so in Genesis, it says we're made in the image of God, and in Genesis 9, it says the death penalty is for murder. So you have to argue against that, which is fine. I mean, that's what John and I have been doing. But of course, God knew that God knew that everyone who died in the flood was made in the image of God. So your argument really isn't with me, I don't think. But let's wrap it up and then keep going. If John can, till about 7:20.
If people want to find you and pick your brain about this, where can people find you? Do you have a website? Are you on Twitter? What's the way?
Are you talking to me?
What's that?
Are you talking to me? Well, yeah. I do blog at Front Porch Republic from time to time, and you can reach me on Facebook.
Okay. Perfect.
So yeah, feel free.
And, for those of you listening on the radio, of course, you can always find us at facebook.com/Theology on Tap Houston, or you can search up #Theology on Air. That's the podcast. And we've got to wrap this up. So until we see or talk to you guys next time, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed. Okay, that was just a touch over 58 minutes. Sorry, Evan.
No worries.
If we go too far, Evan has to go back in and edit and decide who to take a sentence away from or whatever. So.
Yeah, John, when we edit it, it's exactly 58 minutes. So when they put it on the radio, it'll fit in the hour period that they give us. That's why we're doing that. But I did want to, there was something else I wanted to come back to, but I can't remember what it was. Maybe I already said it when I replied to what people were saying on Facebook.
About being made in God's image. And let me read you a little bit of what somebody said.
And let me say this. If I could make a deal where we would abolish the death penalty forever, and we would also abolish abortion at the same time, I would take that deal so fast. What bothers me, I mean, I don't want to make an equivocation on those two people, one in the womb and one who's committed a crime. because civically they're different. I think the Bible regards them as different, even if we all have original sin and such.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never really understood the argument that, and maybe John could maybe explain it a little bit to me. Like, why is it that people will say that if you're pro-life, you should be against the death penalty? Because isn't it pretty clear that there's a distinction between the two persons involved?
Well, I think that's not an argument I've ever made.
Okay.
However, I will say this, that I noticed that many people who reduce every political question to abortion, something that very much gets on my nerves, have a tendency to be, shall we say, a little bit callous when it comes to the life of the poor, for example, or to the death penalty, or to a whole range of issues. So I wouldn't trade the death penalty or anything else off against abortion. Nevertheless, I think abortion itself only makes sense as part of a complete moral whole, and you cannot bracket off abortion and say, okay, I'm going to do everything because it will, I want Supreme Court justices who are going to oppose abortion, and then not worry about whether there's actual health care, whether the children, can get milk, things like that. I am very much opposed to this. While I would not trade off, neither would I bracket off. I would not consider the abortion question apart from the whole panoply of Christian social teaching.
Yeah, the being pro-life should be cradle to grave.
Exactly.
Yeah. There were two interesting things that I heard John say that I don't, maybe Evan is jumping to react to them and maybe not, but and maybe you guys want to take this different direction with our little extra time, but the two things that I heard that I was interested in hearing y'all go back and forth about a little bit. One was when you talked about Christ coming to fulfill the law. You actually said, and maybe I misheard you, something that it actually negates the law because we no longer need it. That raised a little in me. And then the other thing is just the most recent bit that you were talking about. We don't know the background of the people coming into whatever the crime that's being committed. We don't know their story. I'm interested how you think that ought to enter into justice being applied, regardless of whether it's the death penalty or not. I mean, obviously we're not going to get entire backstories on everybody and then prorate the justice system, but in some ways we could put protections in there maybe. So I'd love to hear y'all talk about those if you want, and if you want to do your own thing, that's fine too. I can just step back and listen.
Well, let me address the first question about fulfilling the law, because it's a funny thing. So the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, this seems to be Christ's, what we would call today, stump speech. Okay. All right. This was the core of the message that appears in all the synoptics. All right. So, but he says, he claims he's not changing the law, but Christians very, very quickly, within the time of Paul, abandoned the law. So what's going on here? So Christ fulfills the law and thereby negates it. You don't need it anymore. At least that's Paul's argument, because the law is fulfilled. But he's not going to change the law, but he doesn't talk about the law, does he? He talks about the Beatitudes and he talks about the curses. So he blesses some and
sure.
Blessed are the poor, but woe to the rich.
Yeah.
This is the new law that fulfills and therefore negates the old law. All of it, the civil, the ceremonial, and the moral law. It establishes an entirely new moral law. Not entirely new, because the core of that law is still in the Old Testament. You shall love God with your whole heart and your whole mind and your whole soul and your whole being, and your neighbor as yourself.
Isn't that all of the 10 Commandments subsumed?
Exactly. It's all 613 commandments subsumed.
Sure. So then it's really not negated, is it?
That's right. It's fulfilled. But you and I don't really worry about, whether we followed law 297
Speak for
the
yourself,
left.
John. 297 is my pet.
It's on her bathroom mirror. Day 297 today.
Whatever it is, mixed shellfish with, I don't remember. Evan, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I would say the word negate would dedefinitely be too strong. That's why I said abrogate, and then I backtracked. But I don't really like the word abrogation.
Yes.
I would also say that I would say that and people debate about this. I mean, what Jesus meant exactly in Matthew 5:17 is hugely disagreed upon. I would argue that in a certain manner of speaking, if God ever said it, it's still binding on us, even the ceremonial law. But concurrently, Jesus is fulfilling it now, even to this very day. That's the only reason I don't have to go to the temple and make a sacrifice. So I would actually say that I would take I would say it's fulfilled, yes, and yet, but it's not. But it's still binding. It's still binding. But you see this played out in the New Testament. You know, you see in Acts 10 the vision. You know, so everything that I've made is clean. So now Peter can eat all the animals in the blanket or whatever it is, right? And you know, Galatians and the circumcision, you see the ceremonial law being done away with, and yet the moral law continues. Well, yeah, I mean the ceremonial law, maybe you could use the word abrogated, but I would still prefer to only use the word fulfill. Yeah, moral law is fulfilled too, or else I would have no hope of salvation. Mm-hmm. And yet I'm still called to be obedient to the moral law of God. And if the ultimate command is to love God and love neighbor, well, that requires context. What the hell does it mean to love my neighbor?
It means radio now. Oh,
means not to steal, means not to commit adultery, means not to covet, means not to kill, etc. I mean, so there's and then beyond that, you know, we get into first-degree murder, second-degree murder, third-degree murder. Just last night, in front of my mother-in-law's house in Kansas, an 18-year-old boy was on a motorcycle. He was hit by a drunk driver, killed instantly. And, you know, what do you do with that kind of horrible, that kind of horrible event? We have to figure out, well, how responsible was that driver? Let's see, she was drunk, so she's not 100% responsible, but she took the drink, so she's responsible. She got behind the wheel. Let's call it, I don't know, vehicular manslaughter. You see, we have to take the large command not to murder, and then we have to go circumstance. We will our way down to the law that we have. And, but I would say, I wouldn't say negate. I would say we're still obligated to obey the law, even as it's been. That's that. Uh-oh, we lost a computer.
Lost John. He's been taken up to the Lord.
Okay,
let's go to law number 290.
Okay, let me just say that's the both and. By the way, I want to put in a shameless, not a plug, but I just want to drop this real fast since he's putting his computer together and I'm holding him hostage at the moment.
Do it.
It's all the rage now. We talk about Black Lives Matter. We are talking about slavery all over again. Okay, if the people involved in the slave trade had agreed that my 3 laws merited the death penalty, we would have had no slave trade. It was predicated upon kidnapping. Rape was a regular occurrence between slaves and their slave masters. And I would argue that the whole Atlantic trade, putting people in boats where half of them didn't survive the horrible trip, was nothing short of murder. So if the law of God was in effect when the slave trade began or whatever, continued in that way, chattel slavery, there would have been no slave trade. The problem wasn't that people weren't nice enough. The problem was that we didn't enforce the law of God.
Except for that you had chattel slavery in Israel.
Yeah, but America's considered a Christian nation. We're said to have, we ought to have known better.
But you're saying if we had obeyed the old law, we wouldn't have slavery, but they had slavery in Israel. So the old law did not mitigate against.
Well, I don't know that I'd say they had chattel slavery.
Only mitigated against slavery for Hebrews, not for non-Hebrews.
Say that again.
The law only forbade slavery, except debt slavery, for non-Hebrews.
Well, what I'm saying
for non-Hebrews could be enslaved.
Yeah. I'm thinking about those 3. You said why not 26? Why 23 and 3? And I said rape, kidnapping, and murder. And so my point was that those 3 are part of the chattel slave trade. not to debate slavery in the Old Testament per se, but
I see your point. So
because how did we get the slaves?
Yeah.
They're all kidnapped.
But you don't need the death penalty to rail against to determine that kidnapping is
you don't, but it's a surefire way.
Yeah.
But it's more efficacious that way.
That's right.
But it's not. If the death penalty is efficacious, but obviously the people who engaged in this death penalty
I hear you.
don't have any laws enforced against them, because that's the way that works.
Yeah.
Which going back to your point, Sarah, about the stories, the backstories. Yeah. In a sense, it's not really the point of the law. The backstories are not the point of the law, although after conviction, they do in most states, I believe, hold sentencing hearings in which those backstories can come out. Okay. Yeah. And the judge can consider them. But I'm not so much worried about the backstories, in judging an individual case, but these backstories are also a social reality. Mm-hmm. And so we as collectively, as a society, have some responsibility for some parts of these backstories. Yeah. We create the social conditions which create these backstories. Okay, and in that sense, so that's the sense I was talking about, more the social sense than in any individual case. So we cannot execute a murderer. We have to remember that we're part of a society that produces murderers and produces them in abundance. And so do we also bear responsibility?
I'm on board. I said, you're talking to a Calvinist, so I'm on board with the depravity. I'm following. I'm with you. It's everywhere. But it really,
I kick a man, yeah.
It's something we could do a whole other podcast about. I don't know if Evan told you we just did one. It got some good and some bad buzz about critical theory, and you're starting to kind of get into this idea of collectivism and where as groups we participate in social injustice. It's fascinating, and I see sort of both sides of taking that idea all the way sort of to its logical conclusion, but I don't think we have time to get more into that tonight, right, Evan? Do you have somewhere you have to be? Oh, Evan, you are on mute, my friend. So
yes. Sorry, thank you. Yes, I've got to teach a class or whatever. Have a class
what's your class?
At 7:30. What's that?
What's the class?
I was going to make a death penalty joke, but that would have been wrong. It's just it's an alpha marriage class, actually. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, trying to do the old alpha thing, but I do want to say, John, I have to go, but I really appreciate you jumping on, and I hope I hope again what I'm trying to do is look at the bigger question of whether or not this is. Let me put it like this. One of my concerns is that let's just say that you and I agreed it was an unequivocal fact that the death penalty was part of God's prescription for the world. Could we still worship that God? One of my concerns in the church today is that people will sort of deny the God of the Bible. And this issue kind of helps press that point, right? Like, oh, okay, so it's like I won't worship a God if he's in favor of the death penalty. And so what I'm just trying to do is say, oh, okay, well, then you might not be worshiping the God of the Bible. Not you, John, but one who has kind of an instinctive reaction against it. So I appreciate that you really laid out very important categories and very important points, and that I hope I hope everyone heard that we did this with a tone of friendship and mutual respect. Because I'd love to have you back on. I mean, you're obviously an expert on a great many things. So
one of the running sort of jokes with Theology on Tap, which is the event that sort of birthed this podcast, Theology on Air, is that we often get guests that are very knowledgeable and know their stuff, but they so badly want to be so charitable to the sort of other side that we spend almost the whole time just qualifying how much we love each other. We're brothers and sisters in Christ. And I keep saying we need to get someone on that's going to be a little feisty, like it's going to push back just a little bit, not terribly so that we're mean. And you were perfect. So we definitely need to get you back on here.
Okay.
Yeah. So, okay.
I'm not quite sure how to interpret it, but I'm going to interpret it in my favor. That's because that's my usual rule.
What's your usual rule?
To interpret it in my favor.
Yes, you should. Well, you should, because this is high praise coming from me. I want someone that'll give some pushback. It means you have conviction.
Yeah, that's good.
But you also blew a smoke ring. So, okay. I'm going to end the meeting and have a lovely evening.
Cool. Thanks so much, y'all. Bye.
And keep safe. Keep safe.
All right.